I'm hoping that everyone can hear me, and I am sorry I can't see your lovely faces, but I hope that the internet will work long enough that I can introduce Brittany, who is doing an incredibly important piece of work in a way she has really done what is an advisor's dream. She has put together, first of all, she has put together the first ever database of all climate change lawsuits ever to be created, and in so doing, is coming up with, I think, a paper that, one, will be able to publish in a journal, and secondly, I think will have really useful policy implications, especially for those who want to use the court system to affect climate policy. So she has the potential here to have tremendous impact with this CE project that she's done. She has also really helped define bounds of a very big research project. Some of the members are probably in the room there. If you're in the room there and you want to raise your hand, I know who you are, but if research project members want to raise your hand, those folks are moving on with what Brittany has first done here. We're very, very grateful for the work that she has done that is allowing us to move forward and expand the project even more. So with that, a big thank you to Brittany, and I very much look forward to hearing as much of her presentation as is possible.
Thank you, Dr. McCormick, and thank you all for being here today, here to present my CE, an assessment of climate change litigation in the United States from 1990 to 2014. So this is an outline. I'll start with introduction, move into my research questions, go over my methods, results, conclusions, and there'll be 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions. So, to begin, anthropogenic climate change has caused the Earth to warm an average of 1 degree Celsius from pre-industrial levels. And climate change has implications for health, and it has been called the greatest public health threat of the 21st century. Already, we have seen observed changes in our exposures to elevated temperatures, vector-borne, waterborne, and other diseases. So while this was once thought to be a problem faced in the future, the issue has moved swiftly into the present. So our question becomes, how will we respond to climate change? How will we reduce our risks, and will we do so fast enough? One of the pathways in the United States to address climate change through mitigation or adaptation is through legislative action. However, the political divide on climate change, coupled with general legislative gridlock, has somewhat removed Congress from shaping environmental policy by legislative action. The 113th Congress was called the second least productive Congress in history. The 112th Congress was the least productive Congress in history. And in terms of climate change, hundreds of congressional hearings have been held on the subject of federal action on climate policy. Some bills have even been brought forward, but they all die. They never go anywhere, right? So without legislation, the remaining policy pathways include administrative regulation and lawsuits. And courts are involved in both of these policy pathways. So with administrative regulation, the outcome of a court case can halt or compel regulatory activity, depending on the outcome. And then in lawsuits between private actors, the outcome can potentially change the behavior of polluters by establishing liability. Court cases can also help frame a problem, and they can garner some media attention, which can increase public discourse around climate change and how we address climate change. So understanding the cases being brought and the outcomes is imperative in understanding how the U.S. is responding to climate change. So my study was somewhat based off of 2 previous studies, Markland Rule and Walensky. Markland Rule was completed in 2011 and focused on U.S. cases. Walensky was completed in 2015, focused on cases outside of the United States. Markland Rule looked at 201 cases and found that the plaintiffs were most often environmental or citizen groups and the defendants were most often governments. They found that 80% of cases were climate inclusive, although they predicted more cases over time would become climate exclusive. So what do I mean by climate inclusive and climate exclusive? Climate inclusive cases are cases brought by plaintiffs that are advocating for more regulatory or other action to increase adaptive capacity or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And climate exclusive cases are the opposite. They're advocating for no or less regulatory authority on greenhouse gas emissions or adaptive capacity. So they're the inverse of each other. Markland Rule predicted that there would be more adaptation cases arising in the future. For cases outside of the United States, plaintiffs were equally citizen groups or industry groups, not necessarily environmental groups. The defendants were also often governments, but they were nearly equal on the number of climate inclusive and number of climate exclusive cases. So my research questions are, how has the frequency of litigation changed over time? Who are the key players? And do any case characteristics impact the outcome? So questions 1 and 2 can be compared to that previous Markland Rule study published in 2011. But the final question is something that has yet to be looked at. Do any of the characteristics, which I'll get to in a second, impact the outcome of the case? So my cases were taken from the Sabian Center for Climate Change Litigation chart, which is the same source that was used for those 2 previous studies. And it is updated on a monthly basis by the Columbia Law School and lawyers that are experts in the field of climate change litigation. The definition I used for climate change litigation was any piece of federal, state, tribal, or local administrative or judicial litigation in which the party filings or tribunal decisions directly and expressly raise an issue of fact or law regarding the substance or policy of climate change causes and impacts or pertain to coal-fired power plants. So basically, does the argument bring up climate change or does it bring up coal-fired power plants? Cases that didn't fit that definition were, of course, omitted. I also had to omit a few other cases that were pending and yet to reach an outcome and couldn't fit into this analysis. Cases that had been decided at a lower court but then appealed to a higher court and had a new decision, those lower court cases were omitted. Cases that were decided after 2014 were omitted, and cases that didn't clearly fit into that climate inclusive or climate exclusive definition that I just talked about were also omitted. So in total, I reviewed 653 cases from that climate change litigation chart and included 381. Of all those cases, I went through and coded on these characteristics: the year of decision, the identity of the plaintiffs, the identity of the defendants, the primary law used, the state of case origin, the jurisdiction of the court, climate issue, the litigant goal, that's that climate inclusive or climate exclusive definition, and the outcome. So the climate issue is sort of the main argument of that case. What are the plaintiffs getting at? And it corresponded well to the type of law that was used to argue their case. So for example, cases argued under the Endangered Species Act were usually about biodiversity. So the climate issues are air, water, biodiversity, fuel, coal-fired power plants, adaptation, and other. There are some limitations to this study. The definition of climate change litigation itself is a bit tricky. We have no way of knowing what the true motivations behind bringing these cases are, right? So a plaintiff could argue that, this is about greenhouse gas emissions. Say, for example, someone wants to build an airport in their neighborhood. They could say, well, it's trying to increase greenhouse gas emissions, so we don't want it in our neighborhood. When really, they don't want it in their neighborhood because it would create noise, and they just don't want that there. Alternatively, we could be excluding cases where the motive behind the case is climate change, but the case might be better won under a different argument, like habitat loss. So that's nearly impossible to avoid because motivations, when you're looking at the dockets, are impossible to discern. Additionally, I included coal-fired power plants because they are the number one or greatest source of CO2 emissions in the United States. But it might be useful because they are somewhat different to sort of take those out in a future study and look at them separately from all the other litigation. And then finally, in the outcomes, I coded the outcomes as settled, granted, partially granted, dismissed, or denied. And cases that are partially granted, let's say a plaintiff brings 9 different arguments in a case, and they lose on 8 of them, and those 8 were actually the most important or the core of the argument, but they succeeded on one thing that maybe didn't matter that much. That's still coded as partially granted because they've won some part of their case. So just keep in mind that that partially granted doesn't necessarily mean a win for the plaintiff. So on to my results. How has the litigation changed over time? This is the number of cases decided by year. They really start to kick off in 2007, and they started in 1990. So as you can see, steadily increasing every year. The makeup of these cases is 76% climate inclusive. This is because climate inclusive cases can be brought with more flexibility than these climate exclusive cases because they can be brought for lack of action on climate change, whereas climate exclusive cases tend to be more reactive and they focus more on finding holes in the administrative regulatory process. It's just a lot easier to bring a climate inclusive case than a climate exclusive case. However, climate exclusive cases are increasing or more each year. In 2007, there were close to 11% of all cases were climate exclusive, and in 2014, 20% were climate exclusive. So outside of the US, about half of all cases are climate exclusive, and in the US, our average is about a quarter. So why this difference? And the Walensky paper said that the reason for this is because places like the EU that have a lot of climate change litigation going on also have a lot more rules and regulations around climate change. So that gives climate exclusive parties more of a reason to bring a case. And that sort of fits with what I said earlier. So what are they arguing? The key issues are air, coal-fired power plants, other, a little bit about fuels and biodiversity. Other cases mostly have to do with alternative and renewable energies and energy efficiency, but it's not all that. There are also some cases about building natural gas and oil pipelines in there. So in future research, I've suggested that other category be split up and also an energy part as well. So over time, these climate issues are changing. You can see coal-fired power plants in the red sort of have this inverse U-shape and haven't been as popular of a case to bring in recent years. The number of air cases has really shot up. Other cases have also been increasing there, sort of in the brown. But what I found most interesting were adaptation cases, which are in the purple and at the very bottom of the graph. There were no adaptation cases prior to 2011, and in 2014 there were 6. So while that's not very many, and maybe we can't say that this is definitely a pattern, it's still something to look out for in the future. And maybe as climate change impacts in the United States become more apparent, there will be more cases around adaptation being brought. Second research question. Who are the key players, or who are the plaintiffs and the defendants? So who are the key plaintiffs? Unsurprisingly, the primary plaintiffs are environmental groups. This makes sense because 3/4 of the litigation is climate inclusive. All right, so this shows plaintiffs and the defendants and who is suing whom. Primary defendants in almost all cases are the government. Even in the cases where local and state governments are the plaintiffs, the primary defendants are the federal government. The only sort of exception to this, to the government being the primary defendant, is in the case of businesses where environmental NGOs are the plaintiff. They sue businesses. So cases brought by environmental groups and cases brought by industry advocacy groups and businesses, of course, differ on the kinds of climate issues that they're bringing. Environmental groups sue more over coal-fired power plants, and industry advocacy groups and businesses sue more over fuel. And environmental groups are the only groups that bring cases involving biodiversity. So my third research question, do any case characteristics have an effect on the outcome? And this is something new that I looked at that hadn't been looked at before. So yes, they do. This is a chi-squared table. The type of the defendant is statistically significant when you look at the case outcome. Businesses and industry advocacy groups are much more likely to settle a case. And when you bring a case against a business or industry advocacy group, the case is less likely to be denied. When you bring a case against a local government, the case is more likely to be granted and less likely to be denied. State governments are less likely to settle a case and more likely to have cases dismissed, and the federal government is less likely to have a case granted and more likely to have a case denied. So this is when you're looking at the defendant, not the plaintiff. So if you're bringing a case, this is the likelihood of changing your outcome. The type of law brought was also statistically significant. When you bring something arguing under federal law, for example, the Clean Air Act, the case is more likely to be settled. And when you bring a case under state law, like a state NEPA, a case is more likely to be granted. The jurisdiction of the court was also significant. So a federal district court is more likely to end up settled and less likely to end up dismissed, and cases in state court are more likely to end up dismissed. So in summation, cases in which the federal government is the defendant are granted less frequently and denied more frequently. Cases that use state law and cases in which a local government is the defendant are granted more frequently, and cases in which a business or industry advocacy group is the defendant, or cases in a federal district court are settled more frequently. So what does this really mean? It means that cases against the federal government are less likely to be successful. It's harder to win a case against the federal government. Cases that use state law or cases against a local government are more likely to be successful. So that means that maybe a better pathway or better way to affect change is by using state law or suing smaller governments. And cases against businesses or industry advocacy groups, because they're settled, it's a bit ambiguous as to what that outcome really is. We do know that it's not decided in the court, so you're not really setting any precedent there. But I think it would be interesting to look at these settled cases and see what's really going on, because it's environmental groups usually suing businesses or industry advocacy groups. You know, maybe they're making some headway on mitigation there. That's something that would be worth looking at in the future. So in conclusion, climate change litigation continues to grow. The majority of climate change litigation is a tool in which all types of plaintiffs have attempted to influence or create policy when dissatisfied with the actions or inactions of the government, especially the federal government. I think that there will be more climate exclusive claims as we propose new regulation, or if we propose new regulation. And cases against the federal government are less likely to be successful, so cases against local governments might be a better pathway to effect change. So I want to thank Dr. Glicksman, Dr. Simmons, and Dr. Paddock for helping me understand environmental law and with my analysis. And finally, but most importantly, Dr. McCormick for helping me with the CD process and giving me so much guidance and being really patient and giving me so much valuable feedback. So,
that was really interesting. I'm looking for, I guess there's more CDs coming out of what you did, so I'll be thinking about you when those are going through too. But I was wondering, was health brought up as in any of the litigation?
Sometimes, but usually just sort of as a sidebar, like climate change will impact public health, or it has been called a health problem. That it's not, from what I can tell, it's not like the primary argument. That's not really what they focus on.
So, nice work. This is really interesting. I've never seen this type of analysis before. And it seemed like one of the issues with this statistical analysis that you might have to struggle with is the number of cases. But I'm curious what other kind of covariates and confounders you might, in terms of looking at your analysis, you might be concerned about.
I think that the biggest one is easily the judge themselves, and who they were appointed by and their political leanings. I think that is going to have a pretty big impact on the outcome of the case. And that might be something to also look at. See how it is.
And actually, an interesting thing there is a lot of state and local judges are actually elected and not appointed. And you've got different systems
Right.
at the federal and the state level, and that could maybe explain part of the differences you see at the
Yes.
state and local.
Definitely.
That was an excellent talk, and I, for one, want to study the tables and the charts in more detail. And this, my question probably goes beyond the scope of your research. But the strong difference between federal-based suits and state-based suits, I wonder if part of the reason for the difference, maybe the lion's share of the reason for the difference, might be the presumption in federal law that executive agencies are deferred to by federal courts. Yeah, I can't remember if it's the Administrative Procedures Act, George.
No, that's Chevron deference.
Yeah, okay. Where that's based, where state and local laws may not have that deference to executive agencies at the state and local level. And it's probably beyond the scope of your research, but I wonder if by chance you happen to come across any commentary on that.
I didn't look into that, no.
And it's also an interesting thing about the Administrative Procedures Act is sort of the rules that agencies have to follow to regulate, right, to put out a rule. And I would guess a lot of the federal things that are looking at the Administrative Procedures Act, did you do notice and comment properly? Sort of, they're process things. And I wonder if other kinds of suits are more about the actual arguments or the science or the policy, not about the process, and those might be different. It's just, there's so many things here that are hard to pull apart.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I didn't look at that or what exactly the arguments were to that.
Well, no, because there could be
There's too many.
Reading one
And they're
court
really
case is
long.
horrible, reading hundreds would be awful.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Could you give some examples of the adaptation cases? You said there were 6 in 2014. What were they?
Yep, so a number of them have to do with insurers and insurance agencies in floodplain areas. One of them had to do in New Jersey. They wanted to build like a barrier in a low floodplain area, and the residents didn't want it, and that counted that as an adaptation case because they're trying to develop something to prepare for the impact of climate change, and they talked about climate change in that argument.
Great job, Brittany.
Thanks for coming.